I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, astrophysicist, and the Right Honourable Lord Martin Rees, who's the 60th President of the Royal Society, and Dr. Patrick Nowak, Executive Director of the Centre for Fourth Industrial Revolution of the United Arab Emirates, to share their thoughts on what's next for space endeavours and the race to outer space exploration.
Well, thank you very much for the World Government Summit, and I'm absolutely delighted to have with me in this session astrophysicist Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson and astrophysicist and cosmologist Lord Martin Rees. So delighted to have you here both. So 2020 has been quite a year because perhaps for the first time in history, an event is shared across all of this planet's inhabitants. So a few headline words come to mind: uncertainty. Uncertainty has prevailed, and it continues to prevail. And we all live, I think, through our own personal stories. Change is also observed in virtually every sphere of life: education, employment, perceptions, priorities, but also space exploration. Really, 2020 has been the beginning of three countries, or three missions of three countries that have launched missions to Mars. So countless questions arise as we navigate now through 2021. What will be the next steps for space expeditions, exploration, and collaboration? And also, back on Earth, what can space exploration teach us as we tackle this pivotal century? So I can really think of no better people than Neil and Martin to help us address what's going to happen, hopefully, in 2021 and beyond, in space and on Earth, and what governments really should be doing about that. So Neil, first question really to you. Over the past year and a half, and perhaps a little bit more, there have been a number of new players on the space exploration scene. What do you think has provoked that? Why have there been so many entrants and so much activity?
Personally, I think it's long overdue. Space is for everyone. The solar system is the world's backyard. And for there to have only been one or two players in that over the decades, I think was just, it was not representative of the true spirit of what it is to be human. If this becomes a sort of a private activity of some countries and not others. I will add that the arrival at Mars, one of the missions is the European Union. So that's not a single country, it's the entire sort of European collaboration. So collaborations are an important element of the advance of a frontier, particularly if that frontier is expensive and takes a lot of energy and effort. So I think it's an excellent sign, and more countries, more collaborations, that can only be for the greater good of humanity.
So you say space is the backyard to Earth. Martin, what has been, I mean, if it's truly the backyard, it's been around us for a long, long time, but what has been the inspiration for countries to come together and for countries to start this race? And also, Martin, the other thing I wanted to ask you is, we've got both public players and private players. So what is their different, perhaps, motivations and their outlook?
Yes. Well, let's not forget that the way space started really was military, rockets for nuclear bombs to be on, etc. And that's changed. We still have those things, sadly, but we have commercial launches. And of course, we depend every day on space for communication, DPS, and monitoring the Earth and all kinds of things. So space is important to us every day. But also it is an inspiration, as Neil said, and the cost is coming down. Launchers are cheaper. And the other thing that's happened is that because of the kind of technology that goes into smartphones, you can miniaturize everything. So you can have a lot of complexity in a very small spacecraft. And just to give an example, there's a company in the United States which launched into space about 80 small shoebox-sized spacecraft to monitor the Earth. And they can look at every tree in the world every day, getting lots and lots of data that's valuable for the environment. That's just one example. So many nations can join in because the costs have come down, launches are cheaper, and the spacecraft can be smaller. And that's for looking at the Earth. But when we look for space, then of course this is, as Neil says, something which we ought to do as much in common as possible. And that's why there's been cooperation in the launches heading for Mars, and also there will be in future exploration of deep space. The big question, which maybe we'll come to later, is the role of human beings in space. That's much more expensive, and it's not quite clear how that's going to happen, but I guess we'll come back to that.
Let's pause that thought, because I do want to come back to that. But I think in the first instance, as missions have been lobbed into space toward Mars and beyond, what should be the scientific priorities of these probes and of these collaborations as they reach Mars and as these endeavors start bearing fruit? Neil, what do you think? What is, in your opinion, should be the priorities for these missions?
Yeah, I don't tell people what to do or what their priorities should be. Just as an educator, my goal is to enlighten people as much as possible, so that when governments, when agencies set priorities, it is as informed an exercise as it can be. What I can tell you is, if we think of the solar system as our backyard, then maybe the future of space is not, oh, let's go to the moon first. No, let's go to Mars. Maybe the future is not that. Maybe the future is I'm making this up now, but walk with me here. Imagine a warehouse of rockets, right? And you say to yourself, I want to study the possibility of life on Mars. And you walk into this warehouse and you get this rocket with this booster, you attach it together, and that's your rocket to Mars. Somebody else wants to visit a comet. That's a different combination of rockets. So when I think of the space, I don't want to think of a sequence of destinations. I want to think of space, all of space, as a destination, and it simply succumbs to your own creativity, the creativity of we on Earth. So because you might think of something that I don't. And in that thinking, we have the capacity to assemble a rocket to take you to your destination with the payload required. So to me, it's like building roads everywhere. Now you can choose where you want to go and build where you end up, build wherever that destination happens to be. So sure, Mars and Moon are obvious targets, but throw in the rest. How about asteroids? The commercial opportunity for mining asteroids is extraordinary. All right. What about tourism? What about, like you said, and the science? All of this, these are activities we conduct on Earth. Let space just be an extension of that.
Martin, what are your thoughts on this? Do we need to build capabilities so we can dash into space when we want to or when we need to?
Well, I think there are grandiose plans for mining asteroids and mining the moon, and also there are plans for space tourism. I'd like to say that space tourism, I think, is a phrase that should not be used. It should be space adventure, because it's never going to be safe to go into space. It's never going to be routine, and particularly if this is done, as I think it should be done, by private players, Messrs. Bezos and Musk and people like that, then they're going to do it cheaper than NASA or the European Space Agency, and they'll be taking risk acceptance people, not people who are very cautious, and we'll cheer these people on. So if I was an American, I wouldn't support the manned space program. It's expensive because they've got to be so safe. They should leave it to people who are prepared to fly adventures, prepared to take risks. But that's long term. But going back to the short term, I think if you ask most people what they want most to know about in space, they want to know, is there life out there? And I think most scientists would say the same, because we know that the Earth, it has this amazing biosphere. We don't know how it gets started. We know that Darwinian evolution led from simple organisms to the biosphere of which we're a part, but we still don't know what caused the big transition from complex chemistry to the first metabolizing, reproducing things we call alive. That's still a mystery. It could be such a rare fluke that it only happened here on Earth. It could be something which happened on other planets around our sun, and also on the billions of planets that we know exist orbiting other stars. So to find life on Mars or maybe elsewhere in our solar system would be crucially important, even a vestige of some simple life. Because if we find that, that tells us straight away that life isn't a rare fluke. It says that it happened twice in this one solar system, and that would have the momentous conclusion that life must exist in literally billions of places in our Milky Way galaxy. If it started twice in one solar system, then we know there are literally billions of planetary systems in our galaxy, but it started on those two. So until we find life elsewhere, we can't rule out the possibility that life is a rare fluke unique to the Earth. And that's why it's so important to look for life, first on Mars. Relics of dead life on Mars is being looked for by these probes now, and also look in other places. I mean, one popular places are the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, for instance. But that's, I think, if you ask most people, and Neil, I'm sure, gets asked these more than I do, what's important in space? Are we alone and all that? That's the most important question, I think, for both lay people, but also, I think, for most specialists as well.
Patrick, I just want to add something to what, if I may, to what Martin said. Very important point he made about risk taking and risk factors. But it's rare that I have ever found an occasion to disagree with Martin. But I want to say that at the dawn of aviation, that was one of the most dangerous things you could possibly do to get from A to B. And now it's one of the safest ways to get from A to B. So whatever is the risk factor now to require that we call going into space adventure rather than space tourism, it's not hard for me to imagine the day when space adventure becomes so safe that you bring grandma and the kids and no one is worried that you'll never come back.
It's an interesting point. Absolutely. And, I was thinking before this session about the voyages of James Cook and the others back in the day. And so, are we really at this point in time in terms of space travel or space exploration? Is it really that the direction of travel of safety, cost, accessibility of travel in and through space toward planets, however distant it might be in the future, is that something that really you believe in decades or centuries or millennia to come will be a common occurrence?
Well, I think I'd like to say two things. First, regarding the risk averseness of governments. We know that the space shuttle failed twice in, I think, 135 launches. That's less than 2% failure. But each of those failures was a big national trauma in America. It added extra cost and delayed the program by 2 or 3 years. Whereas if private adventurers crash, then, of course, we mourn brave and resourceful people, but that's not going to delay future exploration. And we've got to think of space in the latter sense, I think, and not the way the American public thought about the 2 shuttle crashes. That's my point. But again, as to how many people will go, I'm skeptical for 2 reasons. The first reason is that the practical case for sending people into space is getting weaker all the time as robots get better. It's true that a human geologist could do a better job than the current probes on Mars, but in future that may not be the case. And fabricating big structures in space under zero G can perhaps best be done by robotic fabricators in future. So I think the only reason for going into space for humans is going to be as an adventure or as a tourist. And that's going to be sort of very expensive. And the question is how many people want to do that, bearing in mind that it's not very comfortable out there. Mars is a very hostile environment. And the thing I certainly don't buy is an idea espoused by Elon Musk and by my late colleague Stephen Hawking, that we should expect that literally millions of people will go and settle on Mars as a way of escaping Earth's problems. I think that's a dangerous delusion, because dealing with climate change on Earth, for instance, is a doddle compared to making Mars habitable. Living on Mars is no better than living at the South Pole or on the ocean bed or at the top of Everest. And millions of people don't want to do that. So I think it's unrealistic to expect huge numbers of people to want to go and live on Mars. Maybe some immense future space station, but not on Mars. So I think it'll be a place for adventurers. And of course, the fabrication of structures on the Moon and on Mars can be done by future generations of robotic fabricators. So I think the case for sending people is going to be just the experience and the adventure.
We've now squarely stepped into the business of multiplanetary species. Neil, you've spoken also at length about terraforming Mars and other similar topics. What's your take?
Well, I'm entirely in agreement with Martin here. The idea that we're going to ship 1 billion people to another planet, or even thousands of people to another planet, on the premise that we need that for the species to survive catastrophe. Just consider, but a moment ago you mentioned Captain Cook. Do I need to remind people that half of his crew in his first voyage did not survive that first voyage? And by the way, he was sailing to places where when they got off their ship, they could breathe the air, all right? The temperature was temperate for people. So the dangers that Martin speaks of are magnified in space by far. And if you want to call Mars home, yes, you would have to terraform it, right? My favorite word of the last several decades. Yes, turn Mars into Earth. But, and you want to do that to escape climate change and problems here on Earth. If that's your goal, just consider that whatever it takes to turn Mars into Earth, that's probably a bigger task than to turn Earth back into Earth. And that just echoes Martin's sentiment here. So I agree. Both of us align in disagreement with Elon Musk and with the late Stephen Hawking on that.
And so and as we've established, the objective for our ventures in space are not really to move vast numbers of people into or onto new planets. What can governments do to expedite and enable space research? And so what are the areas for governments to come together, in addition to establishing where and whether life forms have existed or life has established itself in this solar system or another? So what are the other big prizes out there that governments ought to prioritize and come together to achieve?
Well, just one comment. I mean, obviously, there are sometimes big projects which do require multinational collaboration. Of course, the biggest scientific experiment in space, like the James Webb Telescope, etc., they are multinational collaborations, as are the biggest experiments on the ground, the biggest telescopes on the ground, and particle accelerators like that at CERN in Geneva. So scientists sometimes need to collaborate because they need one very large facility. And that's always going to be the case for space exploration, certainly for trips to the outer planets. But on the other hand, even when individual projects are small and can be handled by a nation or even a single university, then obviously the scientific community, as in every other field, is collaborative. I mean, scientists can straddle boundaries of nation and faith more easily than other categories of people. And so science has always been international, and that'll be even more true in space, because we do have space as something which is our common habitat, part of our environment. We all look up at the same night sky, etc. So I think we hope that the exploration will be collaborative, even if the individual projects don't have to be so big that they involve a multinational collaboration.
If we're thinking about the future here, I want to add sort of a cultural and governmental dimension to this, because I think this ultimately, people want to have that as a kind of a takeaway from these conversations. Consider, at least in my experience and in my review of the conduct of people in response to a stimulus, okay, that there is no force on Earth as potent as the exploration of space is on people's ambitions to become scientists, engineers, mathematicians, the STEM fields, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. When we go out into space, either with people or with robots, but especially with people, then others see that. And it is the frontier of every one of these sciences that has shaped the civilization that we live in. And if you recognize that the foundations of tomorrow's economy will pivot on the innovations in the STEM fields, and you want to now excite people to enter the STEM fields, there's nothing like going to space to do that. In the 1960s, during the Apollo ascent to the moon, the number of people who wanted to major in science and teachers that wanted, it was a force operating unto itself. And so much came out of that decade in terms of innovation in the United States for having been inspired by that. And I will add that the future, just thinking about the future, is half of what drives that. When you look at the World's Fair in New York in the 1960s and all the futuristic buildings and the video telephone. I mean, I remember, I'm old enough to remember this. You say, wow, that's a future that I want. How can I be a part of it? Oh, by the way, we're going to the moon. Imagine if those forces were operating in all countries around the world. You'll bring tomorrow here today.
And to add to that, the word moonshot is now used colloquially for any big project. And of course, we do remember that in the 1960s, it was a public-private partnership which led to this immense achievement. And it's not surprising that certainly in my country, they talk about moonshots as being projects which are well organized and combine enthusiasm with lots of expertise in the public and private sector. I'd like to go back to Captain Cook and the early explorers. I think Captain Cook and even more the earlier explorers like Magellan, they were going into the unknown to a far, far greater extent than any astronauts would now, because they'd got no idea what they'd find in the southern hemisphere. And of course, they were completely out of touch. Many never came back at all. The others came back after 1 or 2 years. And of course, anyone who goes to Mars now, they will already know pretty well what the terrain is like, and probably some supplies were going to before them. So it's not quite the same. And just to tell an anecdote, I was talking to a group of kids about going to Mars, etc. And it's a long way away. And one kid said, it's terrible. I'm told it would take half an hour to get a response if you send a message. And to a kid now, that's an eternity, you know. And I said, tell that to Magellan.
Sign of our times, 21st century. No patience. Mm-hmm. So how can we rally the world around that? If this is such a catalyst, if it really enthuses the excitement and imagination of so many young people around the countries to join STEM subjects, how can we make sure that this is something that isn't just happening, or that is something that is catalyzed by the countries that are currently active in these missions, but how can they become a global reality, global phenomenon? Because if, as you say, it's so much easier to make Earth return to Earth again, become Earth again, as opposed to terraforming Mars, surely the solutions, part of the solutions are found to be within STEM subjects. How can we make sure that this is something that percolates throughout global society?
Well, of course, the countries of the world today are not at equal economic place, all right, in whatever is their trajectory into the future. And earlier when we commented on the rise of multiple countries ascending into space, that correlates strongly, not only with their ambitions, but with their economic platform on which they have gained over the years. So China became a huge player in a way that would have been inconceivable even a short few decades ago. So their economy has been growing behind that. So maybe the answer here is economic opportunity to be as democratized as possible around the world. Then this becomes a natural next thought and the next action that a government takes. And part of it is also making sure everyone is empowered. You want to, if you're looking for an innovation, you can't have some group, some demographic, some gender removed from that access. because you want to take full advantage of all the human creativity that your population can offer. So both of these factors, I think, have to be under the hood, if you will, of what then manifests as the future unfolds.
Yes. And the cost is coming down, of course, and small-scale missions can be run by private sector and by groups in even small and less well-resourced countries. So it's becoming a activity which needn't be left just to the big battalions. And of course, the practical need and the practical benefits are great for environment, monitoring the climate, etc. And of course, bringing the internet to Africa can perhaps best be done by these huge flotillas of very small spacecraft. Of course, that upsets astronomers if they pollute the night sky, but nonetheless, the idea that you can bring broadband to everyone in Africa at fairly low cost with spacecraft is an inspiring idea in its own right, and that would be complementary to these other big projects which everyone could then participate in. So I think it's the cost and the fact that technology is advancing, so it's not as expensive as it was, which opens up a huge variety of projects on every scale.
A quick comment about the phrase moonshot. It's important, at least for me, that the moonshot is not just a big idea that you want to attain. I think a little bit of that idea should be slightly out of reach. Okay, so you don't quite know how you'll get there, but you've already established the destination. And it's when it's slightly out of reach that you really become innovative. And even if you don't reach that destination, other bits and pieces of your creation generally rise up and manifest and benefit other aspects of your culture and especially of your economy. So it's what is your collective ambitions doing, and what are their effects on civilization and on the future of our health, wealth, and security in this world.
I just wanted to keep that. I'm sorry, Martin, you were going to say.
I was going to just say that we shouldn't forget that there is still a dark side, which is the use of defense in potential warfare. There are huge expenditures, certainly in the US and in other big powers, on missiles, anti-satellite weapons and all that. And the US has set up a special space force to do this sort of thing. So it's still the case that much of the highest tech is being used for these military purposes. Not to the same extent as it was in the 50s and 60s, but still to some extent, one of the drivers is the military and the possibility of space becoming an arena for conflict.
You kind of dampened my next question with that dark side reality, which is fine. It is what it is. I don't want to shy away from these topics, but I think so. Really, there's two things now on the back of what you have just said, Martin, and to come back to what Neil said a few moments ago about this collective ambition. It almost feels as though everything we've been talking about in terms of space exploration, about moonshot, about young people getting excited about STEM subjects and this whole problem-solving attitude, that this space reality is a great opportunity pardon me, for our species to come together. Disregarding for a moment the dark side, for our species to come together and perhaps tackle the most imminent and most grave problems. And so I just wanted to ask you, Martin, first, your recent book on the future, so the prospects for humanity. You argue that we are now basically in the century out of 45 million centuries where it actually becomes quite critical in terms of what we do next. So what is your suggestion or recommendation to governments as they navigate not just 2021, but this century and the next 45 million centuries?
Yes. Well, I won't look forward to the next 45 million because that won't be humans. It'll be here on Earth and far beyond. And certainly on that time scale, I'm sure there'll be intelligences far away, which are our remote progeny, even if they're not out there already. But I think this century is the first when one species, our species, has the future of the planet in its hands. And that's because there are more of us. The population's going to be 9 billion by mid-century, and we're more empowered, and we're making more demands on the environment. We're changing the environment in a way that never happened before. And of course, we're aware we've got to feed 9 billion people, and we've got to ensure that we don't lead to mass extinctions, and ensure that we can control climate change. All these things are big challenges, and I personally think that these are probably going to cost even more than anything we want to spend in space. But space will remain an inspiration and part of all these things. But I think we need to inspire young people with the need to feed the world using high tech, and to develop clean energy that doesn't pollute the planet, and all these things. And these are all branches of science, but space is going to be part of those. Space is, as I said, important for the internet and communication in developing countries and all that. So I think we've got to see space as a new arena. I doubt it'll ever cost us as much as getting clean energy for the world, but it's going to be something which we need to support, and which is inspiring, and is going to become ever cheaper and ever better value for money, as it were.
And Neil, of course, I've got to ask you a very similar question. You've been reflecting on possible worlds, right? We stand really looking to the future right now, and we say we've got decisions to make, we've got choices, we have options, but we also have massive opportunities. So what are the possible worlds? What would you recommend for governments, how they might use their space programs, how they might use space explorations, and what might governments do more generally as they reflect on the future in the next few years and decades, perhaps not 45 million centuries, but in the reasonable future?
So a couple of things. I just want to reflect on the year 2020 spilling into 2021 with the pandemic. The fact that we have a word that describes this affliction of the entire world, from epidemic to pandemic, says that we've thought about what it means if we all have to sort of coordinate in an effort. When I think of the coronavirus, I think of an invasion from Mars. Why? Because if we had an invader from Mars that was trying to kill us all, you'd think we would band together and coordinate governments and agencies and policies to fight the common enemy. So coronavirus, being Earth-based, is a shot across our bow. It was a test run to see if we could all communicate and collaborate for a common cause. And it did not leave me with high confidence going forward that the world can come together for a common cause going forward. So that, I just want to share that skepticism. My positive thought is the next generation that I've seen does have a very broad view of the world, and they embrace technology as never before. And they're the ones I'm saying to myself, my gosh, I can't wait until they take over the earth and fix the problems that my generation caused. And that may be the first time ever that an older generation has ever said that about a next generation. So I have high hopes that they will think globally, act locally, but think locally, but act globally. And that global edge, the edge of the earth, is space. And where there are resources, there's adventure, there is the monitoring of what we are doing to Earth, and then what you can then do about it. I have very high hopes for what that generation will bring us.
Thank you very much. So very high hopes, very great optimism, but lots of work to do. So with that, I would like to thank you both very much, Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson, Lord Martin Rees, for your insights, for your heads up for the next 45 million centuries. And with that, I would like to now hand over back to my colleagues at the World Government Summit. Thank you.
Thank you to our speakers for a most inspiring session indeed. Space has created much hope and excitement over the last year, and reignited the curiosities that may have been lost in the pandemic.